So if you're listening to this right now, chances are you've heard the term alpha male thrown around.
Mm.
You know, maybe a corporate boardroom or some dating advice video or just pop culture in general.
Oh, absolutely. It's everywhere.
Right. And it all traces back to this one specific moment. In 1947, there's this behavioral scientist, Rudolf Schenkel, and he published a paper that honestly kind of rewired how we view human culture for the next century.
It really did.
He'd been observing this group of wolves at a zoo in Basel, Switzerland, and he basically wrote down that these animals were just locked in this brutal, nonstop struggle for dominance.
Like a gladiator arena.
Exactly. Just endless posturing, violent skirmishes, this rigid, unyielding hierarchy. And sitting right at the top of that vicious pyramid was the undisputed ruler, the alpha wolf.
Right, which sounds like a great story, but
But there's a massive problem, right? The
Yeah.
term caught on like wildfire. We built this entire archetype around the idea that nature rewards the ruthless, dominating individual who subjugates everyone else. But Schenkel's findings were completely flawed.
they were. I mean, it was entirely an artifact of captivity.
Wow. Just because they were in a zoo.
Exactly. Schenkel wasn't observing the natural evolutionary social dynamics of a wild wolf pack at all. He was observing the extreme stress responses of random, completely unrelated adult wolves that had just been forced into a 10 by 20 meter enclosure.
Oh, man. So it's basically...
It's the biological equivalent of studying human family dynamics by taking a dozen random strangers, throwing them into a maximum security prison cell, and, just recording who gets the top bunk.
That is such a wild analogy, but it perfectly captures the mission of our deep dive today. Because we really have this habit of treating the natural world like a biological justification for our own societal neuroses.
Yes, we project our own anxieties onto them.
Right. We cherry-pick animal behaviors, strip them of their actual ecological context, and then use them to validate our human power structures.
Which is incredibly dangerous. I mean, anthropologists call this the naturalistic fallacy. It's this pervasive, really flawed assumption that just because something exists in nature, it must be this optimal moral model for human society.
Right. The whole "it's natural, so it's good" argument.
It's exactly. But if you actually want to understand the evolutionary roots of cooperation or division of labor, or even why societies form in the first place, you have to look at the mechanics of how these species actually solve the problem of survival.
You have to look at the raw data.
Right. You can't rely on the fables we've projected onto them. And the alpha wolf myth is honestly the perfect entry point for this discussion, because when science finally corrected that myth, it revealed a survival strategy that is so much more sophisticated.
So let's track that correction. Because I know it wasn't until decades later, like the late 1990s, that researchers actually went out into the wild to check this.
Yes, researchers like L. David Mack. He went up to places like Ellesmere Island in the high Arctic.
Right, to observe wolves that had literally never encountered human beings or fences.
Never. True. Wild wolves. And what he found out there on the tundra completely dismantled the entire alpha narrative. Wild wolf packs aren't gladiator arenas at all.
They're families, right?
Exactly. They are nuclear families. The structure is entirely kin-based. The so-called alpha pair that Schenkel was so obsessed with, they're literally just the parents.
Just a mom and a dad trying to raise their kids?
Yes. The breeding male and female. And the subordinates aren't conquered, subjugated rivals. They're just the offspring from the previous 2 or 3 years.
That is crazy to think about. So when you look at the biology, the endocrinology of a wild pale.
You don't see any of the chronic stress markers that you'd associate with constant violent dominance battles. Instead, what you see are highly synchronized cooperative behaviors, which are dictated by Hamilton's rule of kin selection.
Okay, Hamilton's rule. For those listening who might not be super familiar, that's the evolutionary biology concept, where an organism will sacrifice its own immediate reproductive success if it helps its close relatives survive, right? Because they share like a big percentage of the same DNA.
You nailed it. In a wild wolf pack, the entire survival strategy is optimized for propagating shared DNA. So that radically alters how labor and resources are distributed.
Because hunting is really hard.
It is energetically massive. Hunting huge prey like an elk or a bison in deep snow, it's highly dangerous. It requires a really synchronized division of labor.
Right, you've got different wolves taking on different roles, like flanking, driving the prey, ambushing.
Exactly. And think about it. If the pack actually operated on a Schenkel-style dominance hierarchy, the largest wolf would just hoard all the caloric reward for himself, right?
Yeah, he'd eat the whole elk and leave the subordinates starving.
Which would be evolutionary suicide.
Right. Because if I'm the lead wolf and I literally starve my flankers just to prove I'm the boss, I'm not going to have a functioning hunting unit next winter. I'd freeze to death.
Precisely. So the field data actually shows profound resource sharing. When a kill is made, the meat is distributed across the pack, regardless of who is supposedly in charge. The parents eat, sure, but so do the yearlings. And food is even regurgitated for the tiny pups back at the den.
That is so far from the corporate alpha stereotype.
And it gets better. They also have incredibly nuanced post-conflict resolution because, internal frictions do arise.
Sure, I mean, anyone with siblings knows families fight.
Exactly. But wild wolves engage in active reconciliation. They approach each other with submissive postures, nuzzling, licking. And the data shows this specifically lowers the elevated cortisol levels in the group. They are actively consoling each other to maintain pack cohesion.
So it's not just about who gets the most calories. They are actively managing the psychological well-being of their siblings to make sure the team stays efficient.
That's exactly it.
Okay, so wild wolves are less like a ruthless corporate ladder and more like, I don't know, a family road trip where the parents are just trying to keep the kids fed and stop them from fighting in the back seat.
That is a very accurate, if slightly less majestic way to put it, yes.
But if wolf survival hinges on this super tight-knit, kin-based reciprocity, what happens when a mammal operates on a scale where the environment is just too vast, where a small nuclear family can't handle it?
Well, then you have to shift your strategy.
Right, and I'm thinking about the transition in our sources from wolves to elephants.
Ah, yes, elephants. That requires a shift from a strategy based purely on immediate physical cooperation, like hunting, to one based on deep spatiotemporal memory.
Because their environment is so extreme.
Very extreme. Elephants, both African and Asian, live in environments with severe cyclical variations in resources. You might have periods of lush abundance and then, boom, a multi-year drought.
So a small nuclear family structure would just get wiped out. They couldn't survive a localized ecological collapse.
Right, so elephants evolved this incredibly complex fission-fusion social architecture.
Let's unpack the mechanics of that fission fusion thing, because it seems to require an immense amount of cognitive overhead. They aren't just wandering around the savannah randomly.
Far from it. An elephant society is structured around a multi-tier matriarchy. The base unit is the family group.
Which is closely related females in their calves, right?
Exactly. But during times of extreme resource scarcity, the fission occurs. These larger groups purposefully break apart into smaller, more manageable foraging units.
Which makes total sense. I mean, a 6-ton animal needs hundreds of pounds of food a day. If 50 of them stay in one dry river valley, they're going to eat everything and starve each other out in a week.
Precisely. They have to disperse. But when resources replenish, or when there's a need for large-scale defense or mating, the fusion happens.
How do they even find each other across miles of terrain?
They utilize low-frequency infrasound. These are deep vocalizations that actually travel miles through the ground. And the elephants detect these vibrations using specialized Pacinian corpuscles in their feet.
Wow. So they're basically texting each other through the Earth's crust to coordinate a massive family reunion.
Essentially, yes. They can coordinate a reunification, creating herds of hundreds. And the absolute linchpin of this entire fluid-shifting network is the matriarch.
And what's fascinating here is that, unlike human monarchies, this matriarch isn't ruling by, like, divine right or because she's physically beating everyone else up.
No, not at all. Her authority is based strictly on data storage. We are talking about an animal with a massive, highly convoluted hippocampus.
That's the part of the brain associated with emotion and spatial memory, right?
Yes. Her hippocampus is arguably her most vital survival tool. Let's say a historic drought hits, one that hasn't happened in 30 years.
The younger elephants would have zero idea what to do. They have no internal map for that.
Right. Their immediate sensory data just tells them there is no water. But the matriarch, she is accessing a mental cartography formed decades prior, back when she was just a calf following her own mother.
That is mind-blowing.
She remembers the precise geographic coordinates of permanent subterranean aquifers that she hasn't seen in decades. So her leadership is entirely informational.
The herd isn't following her because they're subjugated. They follow her because she has the literal GPS data required to keep them from dying of thirst.
Exactly. And that data isn't just crucial for her immediate family. Ethological data actually classifies elephants as keystone species.
Meaning their behaviors disproportionately affect the entire biome they live in.
Yes. When that matriarch navigates to a dry riverbed, and she begins using her tusks to excavate a massive hole down to the water table. She is literally engineering the environment. She is creating a micro-oasis.
Because by breaking through that dry surface crust, she's exposing water that, warthogs, baboons, birds can get to.
Exactly. Animals that lack the physical morphology to dig for it themselves rely on her. Plus, just their sheer physical mass acts as a landscape leveling mechanism. As they forage, they bulldoze a dense scrubland.
Which keeps the savanna open for grazing species like zebras and wildebeests.
Right, and their dung distributes seeds over massive distances. They actively shape the floral composition of the whole ecosystem.
So the elephant model of survival is this deep embedding in environmental manipulation and generational memory transfer. But, and this is where I want to pivot, both the wolves and the elephants are fundamentally operating on kinship.
They're helping their own families, yes.
Right. So I want to shift the lens. What happens in a scenario where cooperation isn't guaranteed by shared DNA, where survival requires navigating this landscape of, like, self-interest betrayals and calculated alliances?
Oh, then we must look to the primates. This is where we transition from kin selection to reciprocal altruism and eventually to complex biological markets.
Let's talk about chimpanzees, specifically the ones in the Thai National Forest in Côte d'Ivoire, because that research is wild.
It's a radical departure from the rigid family structures we've just discussed.
Yeah.
Chimpanzees live in multi-male, multi-female groups, and their dominance hierarchies are incredibly fluid.
And the fluidity is the key, right? Because it's not a Schenkel-style wolf dictatorship where the biggest, most jacked chimp just beats everyone else up.
Physical strength is definitely a factor, yes. But a lone, massive male will be very easily deposed by a coordinated coalition of smaller, physically weaker males, or even a coalition of high-ranking females.
So it's basically politics.
It is the essence of Machiavellian intelligence. In primate societies, power is a function of social capital. You get it from grooming networks, from shared child-rearing, and tactical alliances.
So to stay on top, a chimp has to constantly engage in, like, social accounting.
Constantly. Tracking who owes them a favor, who has been spending way too much time grooming a rival, who can actually be trusted if a fight breaks out.
And this cognitive accounting is put to the absolute ultimate test when they hunt. The documentation on the Thai forest chimps hunting colobus monkeys. It looks exactly like human tactical warfare.
It really does. It requires advanced spatial geometry and a very deep understanding of the physics of the forest canopy. Because colobus monkeys are way faster and more agile than chimpanzees in the trees.
So a single chimp basically has zero chance of catching one alone.
Zero. And therefore, the hunt must be a synchronized, multi-agent operation. One chimpanzee will act as the driver, pushing the monkey along a very specific arboreal pathway.
Right.
Then other chimps act as blockers. They anticipate the monkey's lateral escape routes and physically cut them off. And finally, an ambusher positions itself way ahead of the trajectory to make the final capture.
Okay, that geometry alone is impressive. But the truly revolutionary insight for me wasn't the hunt itself. It's the economics of the aftermath.
Yes, the meat distribution.
Because if this were a wolf pack, that monkey would just be divided up among the whole family, right? But chimpanzees operate on a strictly transactional economy.
We call it calculated reciprocity. When the ambusher secures the prey, they do not distribute it evenly. The caloric reward, the meat, is fiercely protected. It is doled out specifically and strictly to the individuals who actively participated in the hunt.
Wait, really? So bystanders?
Bystanders, even those who are closely related to the hunter, or even individuals who possess a really high social rank but didn't help. They are actively ignored or even repelled.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Are you saying that chimps in the Ivory Coast understand the concept of earning your keep? Like, if you don't help with the hunt, you don't get the barbecue.
That is precisely what the data suggests. The chimpanzee making the distribution isn't just reacting to whichever chimp is begging the loudest. They are performing an active, retrospective calculation.
Like, did you expend caloric energy driving the monkey? Yes, you get a cut.
Did you sit in the lower branches and just watch? Yes, you get nothing. They are actively enforcing a labor contract.
That is the biological root of a meritocracy.
Exactly. And to execute this, the chimpanzee brain has to possess a highly developed theory of mind. They have to be able to attribute mental states, intentions, and labor outputs to other individuals.
They have to recognize cheating.
And punish it by withholding resources. This meat-sharing behavior is a foundational example of a biological market. Services, in this case tactical hunting assistance, are literally traded for tangible goods.
The cognitive load required to track those biological markets is just massive. It really explains why primates have such large, energy-hungry neocortexes.
It takes immense processing power.
But if we assume that primate-level intelligence is strictly required to run a Machiavellian political campaign, we have to look at an environment that is totally alien to our own, where a totally different lineage of mammals evolved a parallel system of staggering political complexity.
You're talking about the dolphins?
The bottlenose dolphins of Shark Bay, Australia.
Yes. They provide one of the most robust examples of convergent evolution regarding social intelligence, because the marine environment presents very unique challenges.
Right, there are no trees to hide in.
Exactly. There's no physical terrain to defend, no dens to protect. So survival and reproductive success rely entirely on mobile, acoustic, and physical alliances.
And the researchers tracking these pods have uncovered this hierarchical alliance structure that, honestly, it sounds like a mafia movie. It's not just two dolphins teaming up, it's multi-level syndicates.
The ethological literature defines these as nested alliances. At the foundational level, you have what's called a first-order alliance.
Which is what?
This is typically a tightly bonded pair or maybe a trio of adult males, and their primary cooperative goal is to separate a fertile female from her wider pod and aggressively sequester her for mating opportunities.
Okay, so they team up to herd her.
Right. They will coordinate their swimming patterns, their vocalizations to physically corral her, sometimes for weeks at a time.
But the ocean is huge, and it's full of other first-order alliances, right? Other gangs of 2 or 3 males who also want to steal that female.
Exactly. And a pair of dolphins simply cannot defend their prize against 3 incoming rivals. This forces an escalation in social complexity.
So what do?
They form a second-order alliance. To protect their reproductive interests, our initial trio will forge a long-term strategic pact with another distinct trio of males.
So they create a super gang of 6 to fight off rival super gangs.
Precisely. And incredibly, the data suggests there are even third-order alliances. These are massive, shifting coalitions of up to 14 males that form specifically to engage in large-scale territorial clashes with competing factions.
The acoustic processing required to manage that is just mind-boggling to me. They're swimming in this murky 3-dimensional environment, and they have to constantly track the allegiances of dozens of individuals. Like,
Yes.
Who is my direct partner? Who is my secondary ally? Wait, does that incoming dolphin a friend of my enemy or an enemy of my friend? How does their neurobiology even handle that kind of data?
Well, it explains their extreme encephalization quotient, which is the ratio of brain size to body mass. Cetacean brains are structurally very distinct from primates. They lack a highly layered neocortex, but they possess a massive, densely packed paralimbic system.
Interesting.
And they have specialized von Economo neurons, which in humans are actually linked to social cognition and intuition. To manage these multi-level alliances, they rely on signature whistles.
Right, like names.
Exactly. Each dolphin develops a unique acoustic identifier, but they don't just broadcast their own name. They actively mimic the signature whistles of their specific allies to coordinate maneuvers during a conflict.
So they're verbally confirming their coalition status in real time.
Yes, I am with you. We are together.
That fundamentally proves that complex social accounting, like tracking debts, favors, betrayals, it's not a uniquely primate trait at all. It's just an evolutionary response to a highly competitive environment.
It is.
But that brings up an even larger assumption that we need to challenge right now. Because both chimps and dolphins are really large mammals, right?
True.
And we tend to conflate massive mammalian brain volume with advanced cognitive abilities, like big brain equals smart. So can a creature with a brain the size of a walnut engage in that same level of calculated reciprocity?
If you look at the research on corvids, which is the avian family that includes ravens, crows, and jays, the answer is an unequivocal yes.
Which is funny because for a long time, calling someone a bird brain was like a scientific and cultural insult.
It was a massive pejorative. We assumed that because birds lack a mammalian neocortex, their behaviors must be purely instinctual, rigid, almost robotic.
But neurological studies prove that wrong.
Completely wrong. Birds possess an analogous brain structure called the pallium, specifically the nidocallium, which has an incredibly high neuronal density. They pack primate-level computing power into a tiny fraction of the space.
And the behavioral outputs of that computing power are stunning. Let's look at the specific experiments conducted on ravens regarding basically social justice and cheating, because this goes way beyond chimpanzee meat sharing.
It does. This is about establishing a long-term social reputation. Ethologists designed a classic cooperative paradigm using a string-pulling apparatus.
Okay, set the scene for us.
Two ravens are placed in an enclosure. There's a platform outside their reach containing food. The only way to drag the platform close enough to eat is if both ravens pull two separate strings simultaneously.
Okay, so if one pulls and the other doesn't.
The string just unspools, and the food remains out of reach.
So they quickly learn they absolutely need each other. They coordinate, they pull the strings, and they share the reward.
Yes. But then the researchers introduced a fascinating variable. They trained a specific cheater raven.
Oh, I love this part.
This bird would actively participate in the coordinated pull. But the moment the food was within reach, it would aggressively snatch the entire reward, denying its partner any caloric benefit for their labor.
Wow, so it totally violates the labor contract we just saw the chimpanzees enforcing.
Exactly. Now, the crucial part of this experiment wasn't the immediate reaction to the theft. It was what happened months later. Months later, when the victimized ravens were given the opportunity to choose a partner for a brand new string pulling task, they actively and consistently boycotted the specific individual who had cheated them in the past.
Wait, so ravens basically have an avian credit score. Like if you cheat on a group project, they remember you and refuse to work with you next semester.
That is exactly what they do. They didn't just exhibit general aggression towards everyone. They demonstrated highly specific, long-term episodic memory of a social transgression.
They are maintaining a cognitive database of reliability.
Essentially, they are operating on game theory's tit-for-tat strategy. If you cooperate, I will cooperate next time. If you defect, I will defect next time.
And what makes this so profoundly different from the wolves we talked about earlier is that the ravens aren't just enforcing this on family members. They're enforcing it on completely unrelated individuals within a much wider social network.
Which is the biological scaffolding of fairness. A cooperative society simply cannot sustain itself if parasites and free riders are allowed to extract resources without contributing.
Right.
So the ravens have evolved a punitive mechanism, social ostracization, to ensure the viability of their cooperative network.
And we see the necessity of these complex rules because, honestly, in the bird world, the default state of a highly skilled predator is usually solitary. If you look at raptors, like eagles and falcons, they rely on raw sensory superiority, not social contracts.
Correct. An eagle's evolutionary strategy is heavily invested in its fovea centralis. That's the area of the retina responsible for sharp central vision. They have visual acuity several times greater than a human. They can spot a rabbit from miles away.
So when you possess that level of individual lethality, the evolutionary pressure to cooperate just diminishes. You don't need a partner to pull a string or block a monkey. You just dive.
Exactly. But there's always an exception that proves the rule, and the exception here is the Harris hawk.
Right. They are raptors, but they hunt in packs. Why would a bird with the biological weaponry of an eagle decide to share its prey?
It comes down to ecological constraints. Harris hawks live in harsh desert environments where prey is really sparse and heavily fortified in dense, thorny brush.
Yeah.
A solitary hawk cannot physically penetrate a cactus thicket to extract a jackrabbit. So they evolved a cooperative hunting strategy that actually strongly mirrors the chimpanzees.
In what way?
They engage in stacking behavior, literally using each other's backs as lookout posts. When prey is spotted, they flush it out cooperatively. Some hawks dive into the brush to drive the rabbit out, while others hover above in a relay system to exhaust the prey.
It's convergent evolution again. The desert environment basically forces a solitary predator model to adopt a primate-like tactical division of labor.
It's fascinating.
But whether we are talking about hawks hunting or ravens boycotting cheaters, these are localized, small-scale interactions. I want to scale this way up. How do birds solve a massive, continent-spanning physical problem using a social contract? Let's break down the fluid dynamics of the V formation in migratory birds.
This is a beautiful example. When species like geese, storks, or ibises migrate, they are fighting a brutal, relentless war of attrition against aerodynamic drag.
Because flying thousands of miles requires immense aerobic metabolism.
Exactly. If every bird flew completely independently, a significant portion of the flock simply would not have the caloric reserves to survive the journey. The V formation is an evolutionary solution to the Navier-Stokes equations governing fluid dynamics.
Okay, break that down for us. Explain the physics of what is actually happening at the wingtip.
As a bird flaps its wings, it generates high pressure under the wing and low pressure above it to create lift. At the wingtips, this pressure differential causes the air to curl upward, creating a spinning vortex.
Okay, I can picture that.
Now, directly behind the bird, there is a downwash of sinking air, which is terrible to fly in. It pushes you down. But just outside the wingtip, that vortex creates an upwash, a localized column of rising air.
So the bird flying behind and slightly to the side is essentially surfing on an invisible wave of rising air.
Exactly. And telemetry data utilizing tiny heart rate monitors on migrating pelicans and ibises has shown that birds flying in that slipstream experience a 15% to 30% reduction in energy expenditure.
30%, that's huge.
It is life-saving. They adjust their wing beats to stay perfectly phase-synced with the vortex generated by the bird ahead of them, maximizing that aerodynamic free ride.
But wait, the bird at the absolute front of the apex gets zero benefit, right?
A zero benefit.
They are breaking the undisturbed air. They are taking the maximum physical punishment. If we apply the logic of the greedy alpha wolf to this scenario, the biggest, meanest goose would just bully its way to the back of the V and let the weaker birds die of exhaustion at the front.
Right, but that doesn't happen, because a flock operating on dominance would disintegrate and fail to reach its destination. Instead, migratory birds utilize a strict rotational system.
How does that work?
The lead bird pushes against the drag until it approaches its aerobic threshold. At that point, it peels off, drops back along the side of the V to ride the upwash, and another bird immediately shifts forward to take the point position.
It's a completely decentralized burden-sharing algorithm. There is no manager goose shouting orders. They regulate this rotation purely through subtle kinematic cues and warning calls, like, I'm exhausted, you're up.
Yes. It's a perfect biological implementation of alternating altruism, and it highlights a crucial theme here. In all the species we've discussed so far, from the elephant matriarch to the raven to the migrating goose, the survival of the collective relies heavily on the cognitive abilities, memory, and physical exertion of the individual.
The network functions because the nodes are smart.
Exactly.
But that begs the ultimate question. Do the nodes have to be smart? Is high individual cognition a prerequisite for complex societal structure? Because when we transition to the world of eusocial insects, ants, bees, termites, we see the exact opposite.
We really do.
We see individual organisms are basically mindless biological robots, yet they construct societies that rival human megacities in their complexity. It's like they are tiny, mindless nodes and a giant computer algorithm.
We are entering the domain of emergent complexity and swarm intelligence. In eusocial insect colonies, the whole concept of the individual is fundamentally different. An ant or a termite does not possess a neural architecture capable of forming a mental map or recognizing a cheater or planning for the future.
Right.
Yet, their colonies exhibit agricultural farming, climate-controlled architecture, sophisticated supply chain logistics. The intelligence does not reside within the organism. It resides within the interaction between the organisms.
The colony itself is the organism. The ants are just the blood cells.
Precisely.
Let's look at the leafcutter ants, because their agricultural operation is terrifyingly efficient. They aren't just foraging for food. They are literally running a massive fungal farming conglomerate.
They are. Leafcutter ants, primarily of the genera Atta and Acromyrmex, are responsible for harvesting massive quantities of fresh vegetation. But they don't eat the leaves. They cannot digest the cellulose.
Wait, they don't eat the leaves. Then what are they doing?
An elaborate caste system processes this raw material. Larger worker ants use their mandibles to slice massive semicircles out of leaves and transport them back to the nest. Inside the nest, a smaller caste of ants cleans the leaves, chews them into a pulp, and uses this substrate to cultivate a specific symbiotic fungus.
They are literally tending a subterranean crop.
Yes, Leucoagaricus gungulaphorus, and it requires highly specialized labor. The sources note that even smaller ants called minimums ride on the backs of the leaf-carrying ants, specifically to fight off parasitic flies.
One ant doesn't know how to run a farm, but a million of them somehow do it. And down in the fungal gardens, they actively weed out competing invasive fungi, right?
They do. They even possess a biological pesticide. The ants cultivate a specialized streptomycin bacteria on their cuticles that secretes an antibiotic to protect their primary fungal crop from diseases.
That's insane.
This is a multi-species, mutualistic farming operation managed by millions of insects that have zero conscious understanding of agriculture. They organize this entirely through localized chemical cues.
Pheromones.
Right. They lay down highly volatile pheromone trails. If an ant finds a rich source of leaves, it leaves a dense trail. Other ants instinctively follow the gradient of the strongest pheromone concentration. The logistical routing is optimized not by a central planner, but by the decaying half-life of a chemical scent.
It's an algorithm. Positive feedback loops and chemical decay rates solving the traveling salesman problem. But okay, if ants navigate by drawing chemical lines on the ground, how do bees manage their logistics? Because a bee flies through the air, it can't leave a trail of breadcrumbs in the sky.
No, it can't.
Yet a single scout bee can find a patch of clover 3 miles away and somehow communicate those precise GPS coordinates to 10,000 other bees waiting in pitch darkness inside a hive.
The mechanism you're referring to is the waggle dance, which was first decoded by Carl von Frisch. It is one of the most astonishing examples of symbolic communication in the animal kingdom.
Describe the dance. What is it actually doing?
When a foraging honeybee locates a highly profitable nectar source, she fills her crop and returns to the hive. Inside, on the vertical wax combs, in total darkness, she performs a rhythmic figure-8 dance. The other bees gather around her, using their antennae to detect the vibrations and physical angles of her movement.
And the geometry of that dance contains two distinct pieces of data, right? Direction and distance. Break down how she translates a three-dimensional flight path into a two-dimensional dance in the dark.
Let's start with direction. Outside the hive, the bee navigates using the position of the sun as her primary compass. Inside the dark hive, she transposes the sun's position to the vector of gravity.
Meaning what?
Proprioceptors in her neck joints detect which way is perfectly up against gravity. If the patch of flowers is located directly toward the sun, she dances straight up the vertical comb.
Oh, wow.
If the flowers are 40 degrees to the right of the sun, she tilts the central straight run of her figure-8 dance exactly 40 degrees to the right of vertical.
That is mind-bending. She is treating the ceiling of the hive as the sun and mapping the angle accordingly. But what about distance? How does a bee know she flew 3 miles instead of 1?
She measures distance using optic flow. As she flies, her compound eyes track the speed at which the landscape, trees, grass, rocks, passes beneath her. Her brain calculates the optical translation of the environment to estimate distance traveled.
And she puts that in the dance.
Yes. When she dances, she communicates this distance through the duration of the waggle phase, the central part of the figure-8 where she vibrates her abdomen. A longer duration precisely correlates to a longer flight distance.
Unreal.
And brilliantly, she even accounts for headwinds. If she flew against a strong wind, it took more energy, so she waggles slightly longer, essentially telling the hive it's physically further away than it looks.
So it's a localized, hardwired brain executing trigonometric calculations and optic flow telemetry. And again, this isn't an individual deciding to share information out of the goodness of her heart. She is biologically compelled to dance by the sugar concentration in her crop.
It's entirely deterministic.
Which leads us perfectly to the ultimate architectural masters of biological determinism, the termites.
Ah, yes. If bees master aerial logistics, termites, particularly the macroterm species in Africa, they master thermodynamics and fluid mechanics.
They build those massive mounds, right?
Yes, mounds of soil, saliva, and dung that can reach several meters in height. But the mound is not simply a pile of dirt, it is an external lung.
An external one.
The termite colony, numbering in the millions, generates massive amounts of metabolic heat and carbon dioxide. If the mound were sealed, they would quickly suffocate and cook themselves.
So they have to build an HVAC system. But there is no termite foreman holding a blueprint. One ant doesn't know how to build a ventilation shaft, but a million termites somehow run an HVAC system. How do blind insects coordinate the construction of a passive ventilation system?
They utilize a process called stigmergy, where the work previously accomplished directs the work to be done.
Stigmergy. Okay, how does that look in practice?
A termite deposits a pellet of mud infused with a specific pheromone. The physical presence of that pellet and its chemical scent triggers the next termite to place their pellet right next to it. Through these simple localized rules, massive structural arches and flutes emerge. The architecture is explicitly designed to harness external wind and internal thermal buoyancy.
The Bernoulli principle.
Exactly. As wind blows across the top of the tall mound, it creates an area of low pressure, pulling the stale, hot, CO2-rich air up through the central chimney and out through the porous outer walls.
Like a chimney drafting smoke.
Right. And simultaneously, cooler, oxygenated air is drawn into the subterranean network near the base. The structure actively breathes, maintaining an incredibly stable interior microclimate necessary for their survival and for the cultivation of their own symbiotic fungi. The colony functions as a superorganism, and the mound is its respiratory organ.
Okay, we have covered an immense expanse of biological engineering here. We started with the kin-based reciprocity and constellation of wolves. We mapped the multi-generational, data-driven matriarchies of elephants. We examined the calculated, Machiavellian meat markets of chimpanzees and the multi-level acoustic syndicates of dolphins. We watched ravens enforce social justice, migratory birds share aerodynamic drag, and blind insects engineer agricultural empires through chemical algorithms. It is just a staggering display of evolutionary problem solving.
It truly is.
But all of this serves a singular purpose for our deep dive today, to hold this data up as a mirror to our own human society. Let's look at the human reflection.
Which brings us to the synthesis of this whole ethological journey. When we transition from animal biology to human anthropology, we have to tread very carefully to avoid the traps we outlined at the beginning. The naturalistic fallacy. The behavioral models we've explored prove definitively that cooperation, the division of labor, and conflict resolution are not human inventions. They are ancient, highly conserved evolutionary survival strategies. The natural world is deeply cooperative.
But the mechanism of that cooperation in humans is fundamentally decoupled from the constraints that bind animals. Like, the first major divergence is the nature of our social roles. In the animal kingdom, labor division is overwhelmingly driven by biology and genetics.
Correct. A leafcutter ant is born a soldier or a minim based strictly on its morphology. A worker bee transitions from a nurse to a forager strictly based on age and juvenile hormone levels. Even in complex mammals, roles are tightly constrained by sex and kin dynamics.
Human roles, conversely, are incredibly variable and culturally negotiated. We aren't genetically locked in.
Exactly. Our physical morphology does not dictate our occupation. A human can transition from a student to an engineer to an artist to a caregiver completely fluidly across a lifespan. Our division of labor is a construct of cultural evolution, not biological hardware.
Which gives us incredible adaptability, but also creates immense societal friction because we constantly argue over who should be doing what.
We do.
And that leads to the second major distinction, morality. It's tempting to look at the raven boycotting a cheater or the wolf consoling an injured sibling and call it moral justice. But the research draws a hard line there, doesn't it?
It separates biological altruism from abstract moral philosophy. The raven's behavior is an evolutionary algorithm optimized to prevent energy loss. The wolf's consolation is designed to maintain the physical cohesion of a hunting unit.
Right. It's practical.
Yes, these are vital precursors to morality, but they are driven by the immediate biological mathematics of survival. Animals do not possess abstract moral norms or a conscious conscience. Humans are unique in possessing abstract, generalized ethical norms.
Concepts like universal human rights.
Exactly. We possess concepts of justice and categorical imperatives that exist completely independently of our immediate caloric needs or kin relationships. We will advocate for the survival of strangers on the other side of the planet, a behavior that completely defies strict biological determinism.
And we can advocate for them and help them because of our third massive divergence, cumulative technology. A crow can bend a stick to fish for a grub. A chimpanzee can use a rock as an anvil to crack a nut, but a chimpanzee will never look at that rock, deduce the principles of metallurgy, and forge an iron hammer.
This is known in evolutionary anthropology as the ratchet effect. Animal tool use is generally learned anew by each generation or maintained at a localized equilibrium. Human culture acts like a ratchet, preserving innovations and modifying them generation after generation.
We don't slide backward.
Right. The mastery of fire led to metallurgy, which led to the steam engine, which led to the microprocessor. Our survival is no longer dictated solely by our physical bodies navigating the environment. It is dictated by our cumulative technological buffer against that environment.
So we have culturally fluid roles, abstract moral philosophy, and cumulative technological power. We are fundamentally playing a different game than the rest of the biome. So why are we so desperate to look backwards?
It's a great question.
If the alpha is a myth and early humans were actually egalitarian, why are we so obsessed with looking to nature to justify inequality and rigid hierarchies today? Why do we still want to be the alpha?
This raises an important question, and the answer is that navigating cultural fluidity is exhausting. It requires constant philosophical negotiation and societal restructuring. It is cognitively much easier to commit the naturalistic fallacy to point to a wolf or a primate or a beehive and claim that rigid hierarchies, inequality, or strict gender roles are simply the laws of nature.
So if inequality is dictated by biology, then those at the top of the human hierarchy do not have to justify their position.
And they do not have to work to alleviate the suffering of those at the bottom.
It's an intellectual cop-out. It's the philosopher David Hume's classic is-ought problem. Just because something is a certain way in nature doesn't mean it ought to be that way in human society.
Precisely. And if we look at our own deep history, during the Pleistocene, early human hunter-gatherer bands were fiercely egalitarian. They
Mhm.
actively suppressed dominance behaviors to ensure group cohesion.
Wow.
The rigid, stratified hierarchies we see today largely emerged with the advent of agriculture and sedentary resource accumulation. They are a recent cultural invention, not a biological mandate.
Exactly. So the ultimate lesson of comparative ethology is not to find a blueprint for human society, but to appreciate the vast diversity of evolutionary solutions. Nature provides evidence for matriarchies, egalitarian networks, complex biological markets, and eusocial collectives. If you want to justify a specific human political system, you can always find an animal that seems to validate it. But that is cherry picking.
It is using nature as a ventriloquist dummy to voice our own biases. We have to stop looking at the animal kingdom as an instruction manual for how to oppress each other.
We must look at it as a testament to the power of cooperation. The prevailing truth across almost every species we analyze today is that isolated selfishness is an evolutionary dead end. Survival requires managing the tension between individual needs and collective stability.
It really does.
And that leaves us with a truly profound realization. We started by tearing down the myth of the alpha wolf, this idea that we are biologically destined to be ruthless dominators. We've seen that the natural world is actually held together by empathy, shared labor, and memory.
Mm.
But our human superpower isn't just our capacity to cooperate, it's our conscious control over how we cooperate. Because our roles aren't genetically fixed like an ant's, and we aren't bound strictly to kin like a wild wolf.
Mhm.
I want to leave you, the listener, with this thought to mull over.
It's a crucial point.
If evolution has granted us this massive, energy-hungry neocortex and given us the capacity for abstract morality and cumulative culture, does that mean humanity's greatest evolutionary adaptation isn't our technology at all? Is our true superpower our terrifying, beautiful freedom to look at our society, recognize its flaws, and completely rewrite our own social contracts whenever we choose?
We are the only species capable of entirely redesigning our own hive. It's a monumental responsibility.
We don't have to be the alpha. We don't have to be the drone. We get to decide what the reflection looks like. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of the natural world and our place within it. Keep questioning the mirror.